We're really so thrilled to host today's event and to be a supporter of the launch of the Wetland Book Project. In my own sort of recent thinking and listening through a recent CBC broadcast on how our bodies are so maladapted as urban beings and how we're constantly in a heightened state of cortisol because of that condition. And this is such a timely project to think through and to sense through what it means to understand spatially an interspecies across flora and fauna connection that we have to the sites that we live and work in. I do want to just give a little bit of a background and just mention that this comes from almost a decade of work starting in, for Mark, starting in 1997 with your move to Saturna Island, beginning to think through the space of Saturna Island, and then in 2012 sort of more formally starting to capture some of the sounds, and that is the sort of the origin of the project, which I understand is 6 years long, and with many, many different iterations that I'll let them talk about. We did in 2018 at Griffin present the wetland scenario, which was the composition aspect of this very, very layered and multimedia project. So we're thrilled to be here again to host this event. We encourage you to stay for the book signing afterward and the wine and cheese. And I'm going to introduce Mark and Brady. And this is going to be a very partial introduction because you've both done so much. So know that there's much more. Mark Timmings is a multidisciplinary artist who explores perceptions of place by appropriating data and unfolding them into the domain of art. His works form an intimate, and vital web of interconnecting natural cycles and human patterns. He transforms field observations and aspects of science into these aesthetic and contemplative experiences, which also function as conceptual machines driven by algorithmic systems. Mark Timmings has done numerous projects unfolding over the years across these disciplines. He is also a graphic designer specializing in visual arts and cultural projects, and his design career also spans over 3 decades and includes collaborations with artists, writers, curators, and cultural institutions. And he's received over 100 international awards for his publication designs. Most recently with projects on Ray Arden, Hank Bull, Jeffrey Farmer, and Etienne Zach. Brady Marks is a digital media artist who works primarily in audiovisual practices, new media, and kinetic art. She obtained an undergraduate degree in computer science from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and a master's in interactive arts from SFU. With Chris Wellesby, she implemented a real-time weather data transition system covering 4 continents for tree studies in 2006, a 3-screen digital media installation presented at the Gwangju Biennial in South Korea. Her interactive light sculpture, I Am Listening, was commissioned and acquired by the Surrey Art Gallery, where it is on permanent display. She has collaborated with Jeffrey Farmer on 7 works and has worked in conjunction with Vivo Media Arts and received Innovations Grant funding from BC Arts Council for the research and creation of a volumetric display device that generated interactive 3D sculptural images, which was presented at the 2015 International Symposium on Electronic Art. As a graduate of SFU, taught by faculty including original members of the World Soundscape Project and as a member of the Soundscape Collective at Vancouver Co-op Radio, Brady Marks is an inheritor of the WSP legacy of acoustic ecology. She is a frequent host of Soundscape on Co-op Radio, as well as a member of the Vancouver Electronic Ensemble and a DJ working under the alias of Furious Green Cloud. Mark and Brady, welcome.
Okay, so, wow, it's amazing to see so many people here today. I had no idea so many people would show up, but anyway, thank you for coming. And as most of you probably already know, the Wetland Project is an ongoing multidisciplinary study of an environmental soundscape. It's the soundscape that you're hearing right now that's playing in the background. When Brady and I first started the project, we imagined we would mostly be investigating the sounds of nature. But this exercise in active listening has taken us into a deeper relationship with the land than we ever imagined. Listening to the world around us has helped us to understand that human history is inseparable from the natural history of the places we inhabit. It's led us to contemplate those who have lived in and taken care of these lands and these waters since time immemorial. And we're very grateful to be here at Griffin Art Projects, here right beside the McKay Creek Marsh, in the territories of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. May we learn to live up to the honor of being in this place. Because the Wetland Project is a post-geographical work, we must also acknowledge that the soundscape we are listening to was recorded on the lands and waters of the Wasanich First Nations, particularly the Sayout and Seacom, whose reserve lands on Tucktuxin, also now known as East Point, Saturna Island, are adjacent to the marsh on which the project centers. The Tucktuxin Marsh is also within the extended territories of the Hulkaminam and Hunkaminam speaking peoples. So Brady and I would like to thank Lisa Baldessera and all the staff here at Griffin, in particular Fawn and Charlie, for graciously hosting this book launch today. And a huge thank you to Vancouver New Music, Simon Fraser University, other sites for artist projects, Emily Carr University of Art and Design, Barbara Cole, and Figure One Publishing for co-presenting this event. The book itself would not have been possible without the support of the Canada Council for the Arts and the BC Arts Council, and so many others. And a shout out to the collaborators that are here today. Alex Muir, one of the writers in the book, Karen Love, who, without Karen, there would be no book, who helped enormously with fundraising for the book, and also to the panelists who Brady will introduce very, very shortly. And finally, I just wanted to say that today we are remembering our dear Wetland Project colleague, musicologist Stephen Morris, who died as we were putting the pages of this book together. So I'm wearing his shirt today, and in his honor. And Brady, don't you?
Thank you. Thanks all for coming. I recommend you talk to other people here because this is quite a cool crowd. You're all. For me, it's overwhelming actually to see you all. As many sound people, I'm more comfortable in a studio alone, and so do enjoy this opportunity to meet your fellow colleagues and Ordal curious amongst yourselves. Thank you to the panelists for agreeing to take the pressure off us and take it away here. I'd like to introduce them. I overheard Andrew telling us that we had the Bob Dylan of audio recording here today. That would be you, Hildegard. So, Hildegard Westerkamp, also known as the Bob Dylan of sound recording, is a careful listener, composer, radio artist, and sound ecologist. From 72 to 80, she was part of the World Soundscape Project at Simon Fraser University, working with Ari Mary Schaefer to define the field of acoustic ecology. She was a producer and host of the innovative and groundbreaking sound walking program at Vancouver Carr Radio. Her sound walks have been presented internationally for over 5 decades. And is an inspiration to myself, I have to say. We once shared a sound walk together, but it was just the two of us, and we went swimming at the aquatic center. It was pretty bomb. Hildegard is a founding member of the World Forum of Acoustic Ecology and is the chief editor of the journal Soundscape. Was the chief editor from 2000 to 2012. Dylan Robinson is a Hallmark artist, curator, and writer. He was the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts at Queen's University from 2015 to 2022 and is currently Associate Professor at the University of British Columbia School of Music. We're very happy to have Dylan here in our community as a member of the geeky soundscape folk, if I may. His research focuses on the politics of Indigenous inclusion and recognition in the arts. He is the author of essential reading, everyone, Hungry Listening, Resonant Theory for Indigenous Sound Studies. With Candace Hopkins, Robertson co-curated Soundings, show which is running from 2019 to 2025. This touring exhibition features scores and sounds for decolonization. Laurie White is a curator and writer. She holds an MA in Critical and Curatorial Studies from the University of British Columbia, where she currently is pursuing doctoral studies in art history. Her research addresses forms of ecological practice in contemporary art, including material culture and phenomenology, and maladux perhaps, as they relate to place and landscape and post-human and the representation of animals in art. White's essay, Listening to the Wetland Project on Earth Day 2020, was published in Luma Film and Media Art Quarterly in the winter of 2021. And Laurie is uniquely positioned to be a bridge between having a clear understanding of our work and the academic surrounds, and was just the perfect person to facilitate this discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand the techno talking stick to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark and Brady, for inviting me to be part of this project. It's been really exciting, and as I get more and more interested in swamps, this project has really been an important part of that research, what could be a PhD research project. And I just wanted to tack on to the territory acknowledgement that today apparently is Pacific Crabapple Tree Day, and I understand there have been some events over at the Maplewood Mudflats celebrating what is an important, culturally significant food for the First Nations people of this region, and also a really important part of the ecosystem here. So just thought it was very appropriate today to kind of start with the crabapple in mind. So I wanted to start the panel by offering Dylan and Hildegard the opportunity to introduce yourselves and your work for people who might not be familiar with what you do, and your kind of attitudes to listening in a very broad sense.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Brady and Mark, for this amazing piece of work that we can all hold today. And the whole process of that project has been amazing. And I would also thank you for the gallery to host all this here. And I'm very pleased to be on the same panel with Dylan and with Laurie to do this together here. Let me start with my attitude or my approach to listening. I would just want to speak about where we are right now here. I have been, that will pretty much tell you what I do. I have been having a really hard time hearing the introductions. It's a very reverberant space here, and so I'm speaking a little bit more slowly so that maybe the words arrive clearly at your end. I'm not sure what it sounds like for you there. For me, the speaker was just too much in your direction that I couldn't actually hear a word of what was spoken at the beginning. So I also am wearing hearing aids, and so I'm sort of getting used to the fact that I'm losing a little bit of my hearing, and it's a little bit unpredictable how I can relate to space. And it's interesting that in galleries, we often do have this kind of reverberance where usually it's expected to be quiet in these places, to view the piece of art, to be with a piece of art. And that's sort of the traditional sense of a gallery. And most galleries have had to adjust to the introduction of sound art into their spaces and had to hopefully adjust acoustically to kind of change the acoustic space of a place. So I'm very grateful to be here. I would say, though, acoustically, it is a difficult space for all of us. And so I think we need to take extra care today to relate, to communicate because of the acoustics. So that's my introduction to myself as a listener and composer. I compose with environmental sounds mostly, recording sounds. I have recorded my own sounds and used those sounds for my musical sonic expression in my compositions, and they usually end up on loudspeakers. Maybe there will be some live instruments too. And yeah, otherwise you have heard some of the other activities that I've done as well. So thank you for being here. Dylan, you next.
Thanks, Hildy. Eiswail te ilil tol squich te litzel qua kesta alets. Cheat so latzel te skohomish kesta ewatash hormach equala. Equus haqualetsa te siwas te siala quat. Horsh metchap te tamach equala. So in Halkamelum, which is the language that Stalo folks speak, I very quickly introduced myself. It would be a much longer introduction if I was home. I am kind of home, but our territories are a little bit outside of Vancouver, extending from about Fort Langley all the way up to Yale. And as I was saying to Hildy, we identify as Stalo people, because all of our 27 different communities are located along the Fraser River, the colonial name, the Fraser River, but we know as Testalo. That's what it means, river. And so we identify that way as a way to speak of the unity between our communities. And of course, there's a larger, other kinds of community relationships that I was telling Hildy a little bit about earlier. You know, I extended my thanks to my Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish relations. We have lots of interfamily relations between our communities and nations here. So in that sense, I am home, you know, and in more physical contact with communities that are here in this, very much in this location now. So, and I'm also recently arrived back in Vancouver, or Alets, as Stalo folks say, Alets, which means wide at bottom. And this is because we understand this place as the place where the river, Testalo, opens up. So our sense of directionality is all based on the river. And we even refer to our downriver relations, which are the nations that are here, and they refer to us as our upriver relations. So that's a little bit about. And so I'm back here. I've just moved back. I'm based at UBC now, but for the past 8 years, I've been living in Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe lands in Kingston, Ontario. So I'm really thankful and happy to be back here. As part of this, the communities plural that are working here. So a little bit about my relation to listening. For a long time now, I've been thinking about what listening is from a settler colonial perspective and from indigenous perspectives. And actually both of those should be in the plural. Because I think one thing that tends to happen when we're talking about indigeneity and listening or critical race theory and listening is that it becomes reified. Like we people tend to think of it as like a singular practice, but of course it is nuanced. And so when I talk about listening from a Huolmach perspective, that's another way we identify as Huolmach, as our people. I think about it as not exclusive and shifting. It's always shifting in relationship to the place we're gathered in, the reasons why we are gathered in that place, the particular folks that we are in the room with, and then of course all of those aspects of my own positionality that extend beyond who I am as Huolmach, as a father, as a cisgendered man, as someone from a kind of middle class, but even not even middle class background with my family, and all of those privileges that come to constitute who I am, also constitute what I call my listening positionality. They allow me to hear certain things, and they work against me hearing other things. So positionality is so central to how I think about how we are able to listen, our capacities in listening, and those are always shifting as well, right? So we can't just say to someone, you're listening in an indigenous way, full stop, right? There's sort of an absurdity around that kind of claim. So really thinking about the gradations of listening and the ways that we are listening through those kinds of listening positionality filters to specific things as well, because those things also shift how we listen. So maybe I should end it there so I don't go on and we have other conversation. But thank you so much to Brady and Mark for inviting me to be part of the larger set of conversations in the book about the Wetland Project, and for inviting me to be here in relationship with these lovely folks and colleagues.
Great. So building on those introductions a little bit, I wanted to ask you both about a time when your experience or your attitude to listening was maybe challenged or extended or something kind of maybe disruptive.
I used to talk a lot about the sort of aha moment of my life when I heard a lecture of Murray Schaefer's in the music department at UBC, where you are now. I was a music student. This was in 71 or 72, and he gave a lecture coming from SFU as a guest, and I basically left that lecture with my ears popped open, never to close again. And basically it was the beginning of my sort of journey through the soundscape, through learning to listen, to composing, to writing, to over and over again sound walking and relearning the listening. And many of you know the story of that aha moment. But really what I want to talk about today is, because this is a fabulous opportunity, is that the last time I was literally rattled in my listening was when I opened the book Hungry Listening by Dylan. I was not aware of Dylan's work, but I saw this book, and I saw the title of the book, Hungry Listening, and I bought the book on the strength of the title. And opened it immediately when it arrived. And there, right at the beginning, Dylan confronts me with a completely outrageous quote by R. Murray Schaefer at the top of the book. And it absolutely rattled me, because Murray was the man who made me aware of listening and hearing, and Murray was always a rather outspoken man who would like to rattle people himself. and wake people listening up and do things differently. Whether it's his ways of composing, whether it was his way of giving a lecture or whatever, it was always very much even the educational Murray, the music educator, wanted to do things differently, and that was the great inspiration at the time. Now I find myself being absolutely inspired by this other concept of listening that opens doors for us in a, I think, rather not just intelligent but deeply sensitive way to the situation that we find ourselves in, and myself as an immigrant, to open our ears to welcome and listen to the issues that we have been having in this country between indigenous peoples and settlers. And even though I thought I was aware of it all, I feel now there is a kind of a new way of listening, a new way of approaching it, and the concept of hungry listening, of course, is challenging, to say the least, because it really demands a kind of a self-listening, a self-examination, and who am I as a listener now, and who have I been? And it's really invited me to question my absolutely whole life and my whole approach. And I am actually very grateful for it. I was a bit scared of it, but because there's so many things that we do unconsciously in various stages of our lives. And so we think we do our best and we try our best, and then someone comes along and makes us aware. And in a way, this, well, maybe not just makes us aware, makes us re-listen. And that's the nature of listening anyways. I mean, as Dylan was saying, it's a constant shift all the time. And to be aware of this shifting perception that we're dealing with on a momentary, daily level, but also through our lives, is a place of grounding, has become a place of grounding for myself in order to be able to work. To know that everything shifts all the time and nothing is certain is actually a grounding reality from my perspective. And so, yes, I got rattled, but I also feel there's a new way of approaching this. And listening has become, even in the face of climate change, now climate crisis that we're in, the emergency, it's become apparent how an approach to listening and a knowledge of how we listen can assist in us to work together, I believe.
Wow, thanks so much, Hildy. It's very generous of you to say those things, those lovely things. I'm also kind of tickled that you used the word rattled and scary, and these kinds of things. I had an unfortunate incident. I just laughed at this unfortunate incident where a colleague, was talking to me and said, "You are actually so much nicer than your book." And I think I have some of that Armory Schaefer. I did my undergraduate degree at SFU, of course, and so much influence, right? Even though much later than Schaefer, and you were doing work there, but so much influence I think was made in that my time in the School for the Contemporary Arts, and that kind of desire to push, I think, is really perhaps also an inheritance that I have from that space and time. I also think of sometimes a quote that stays with me from a review of Susan McClary's book Feminist Endings on, I think this is actually, I wrote this in Hungry Listening as well, as where a reviewer said, "I couldn't put the book down unless I was throwing it against the wall." And I thought, wow, that's great. But let me get back to, you asked the question about something that shifted our listening. And for me, I think that would be a quite recent, or a fairly recent work. I guess maybe not that recent, in 2017. It feels recent in my mind. And this work is Rebecca Belmore's Wave Sound. And this is a piece, Rebecca Belmore is an Anishinaabe artist that I'm sure most of you know, who created quite a long time ago, I don't know the exact dates, another work called Ayumi Awak Omama Moan. I think I've got my Anishinaabe a bit mixed up there, but the English translation is speaking to their mothers, or to their mother. And it's a work that is a large, it's like a megaphone that was designed for Indigenous folks to speak to the land, for our voices to be raised in speaking to the land, our relation, the life of the land. And as a work about empowerment as well of Indigenous communities, and this work has continued to travel across our lands and give us voice in different ways. But the work that I saw is a kind of parallel to that work. It takes a similar form. It's a long conical listening device that Belmore made from an imprint of the land. And this device has a small ear on it at the one end of it, and is directed back at the land. And also situated in national parks. It was part of, what was it called, the National 150 celebrations of this state we call Canada. And so she set up this work in a variety of different locations in national parks across Canada, directed toward the land. And I thought, I need to go and visit and spend some time with one of these works. So I went to Mi'kmaq lands, Gros Morne, what's now called Gros Morne National Park. And I climbed up the hill there at the park to see, this is very, it had quite a visual, it's a giant listening device directed at the land, so it calls you to it in a way, and calls you to, say, this is important, you should be listening here. And then when I put my ear up against the end to listen to, what I heard was almost nothing. I couldn't hear the waves, I couldn't hear the gulls, I couldn't hear anything. And it wasn't a particularly quiet day, but what was important for me about spending time with this work is the relationship that it has with the land. It's situated quite low to the ground, and to put your ear up against the listening device, you actually need to position your body on the land in a very different way than you normally would. You have to have a different kind of connection to the land. And I had to contort my body and sort of place my arm on the land and realize that, in fact, this is a much more foundational request. That to listen, we need to be in a different relationship with land than purely a relationship through our ears, of listening with our bodies in relationship with the land. So that was really an important moment for me. And also in thinking about how I move forward in listening and spending time with the life of land in places where I'm a visitor, where I'm a guest on other Indigenous people's lands. And the time that takes, I think sometimes it feels like we might want to jump towards a recommendation, but as I wrote in the piece for this book, I think one of the things that this project does is give us a long time of listening, where we don't need to jump into action, where we can just spend the time thinking about relationship to what we hear. And I think that's an incredibly important, I was going to say gesture, but more than gesture, towards not jumping into action right away. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, so bringing this back to the Wetland Project, I think one of the really interesting things that it does, and that's kind of explored through several texts in the book, is a return to a proposition for wilderness radio that was made by Bruce Davis, another member of the World Soundscape Project, in a 1975 article. And this was for a radio service that would listen in rather than broadcasting out, by transmitting the ambient acoustic activity of a specially chosen protected wilderness environment to listeners via an FM radio channel. And I just want to quote the article for anybody that's not familiar with what this is or what Bruce Davis says this could do. He says, in providing observational access to a wilderness environment without significantly altering it in any way, the project would be unique. Large numbers of people could experience the place without destroying it by their very presence. This radio service could, as an educational tool, begin a process of positive feedback between man and his natural environment that conceivably could alter for the better the perceptions and orientations of whole groups of people. So we, all three of us and several other people in the book, in the Wetland Project book, comment on this text as a very important reference point for this project. And I think this affords a kind of reassessment of the ongoing possibilities and also problematics of what this proposition was about. So I just wanted to ask you to kind of expand on your relationship to this this text and how this is realized in this artwork in particular. Hildegard, you're a little bit more optimistic about the ongoing sort of potentials of this gesture of wilderness radio. And Dylan, you're a little bit more kind of like skeptical, perhaps. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I just want to harken back to that time when Bruce, in our World Soundscape Project group, came up with this idea. And Barry Truax, my other colleague from the World Soundscape Project, is here and may remember that we were all really excited about this idea. And one of the things that I remember that sort of stuck in my mind the most was we were trying to figure out how can this actually be actualized in the 70s. And we were beginning to look at flyover maps, like where was there a spot in British Columbia where there was no airplane sound, where we could put a microphone or a series of microphones and get a sort of a purity of the wilderness. That was sort of the idea. Can we get away from technological sounds at all? And so that was part of the sort of beginning to think, like, how can we actually do this? And I was also involved, or it was a little bit later, but I was interested in Vancouver Cooperative Radio that was starting just in 1975. And eventually did my program Soundwalking there. And so the idea of radio becoming a more flexible medium that was different than the CBC and different than the commercial radios, and that we could actually do all sorts of interesting things with listening into the environment rather than being broadcast at. That was sort of the excitement for me personally at the time, that there was a building of a relationship to the environment through the placement of microphones. And the microphone itself was so new at the time as a portable instrument in the environment that when you listen to the environment and then you hear it through headphones as the microphone listens to it, it wakes up your ears in amazing ways. It's a tool to learn to listen more. And that was the atmosphere in our group about trying to relate to the environment in a much more conscious way and understand what are the voices of the environment and how do they impact us, and are we even conscious of that? And it started with a noise issue, like one of those seaplanes. In the harbor, Murray was disturbed by the seaplanes in the harbor because he couldn't compose, and that was the impetus, apparently, for this more activist aspect of our work. So reaching out into the environment, just like we at Carr Radio, we took the microphone into venues and broadcast over telephone lines. The live music in Vancouver, that was exciting that we could do that we could reach into the community and have that exchange between listener and community. And doing the same with this amazing environment here seemed to be very expanding at the time. And learning more about what wilderness, what happens, what do we even know? Because as urban people, we are not living there, we don't know, we may not have a relationship. And so maybe that was one step to bring that closer to the urban reality. Nowadays, we have all the tools necessary to do something like that. And there is ways of data gathering now where microphones and video cameras are put into the environment, and then the data are used for analysis of what's happening in the environment. And yeah, we can have big debates about the way of doing that. Are we actually listening, or are our ears there, or is it just data? And how can we combine the scientific knowledge that we get with an actual listening, relational listening to the environment? So yeah, there's hope on that level, but I think it all ties in absolutely with, we want to know about this because we care for the environment, and we are beginning to get really afraid of climate crisis. And so there's an urgency to this. And it suddenly sinks in that maybe we need to really, really listen on all these different levels. And if we can get, like Murray's vision was, scientists, artists, cultural workers, everybody should be getting together, working on all this. We all have, anybody who has knowledge about sound in our society should be working together on these projects. And we're getting a bit closer to that. As long as the people that are doing the scientific work and the listening do in fact also take seriously the practice of listening. I think that's probably all I should say at this point.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick up on that a bit, because I do have a critique of ecologically oriented art. I won't say soundscape composition specifically or any particular form specifically, but the critique emerges from that question of, are we actually listening, or are we consuming? Are we feeding our climate grief? Are we centering our climate grief in ways that actually obscure our relationship to land? And I think that's a really important question, because there's been a lot of work, your work and so many others' work, to raise awareness of the climate catastrophe that has been growing for so many years. And so I am more pessimistic often, not always, but often, around the centering of that grief in work, and I don't think that's something that this project does. But I also think, as a contrast to what I was saying earlier about having that space to just listen, there also needs to be a commitment to a reflection around what that listening is, and where that asks us or demands that we move to. If we think of listening practices as compelling us, as saying we must or should or need to do something, then where does that lead to? Because I worry about aesthetics. I worry about the sort of, the way in which we might say that's a beautiful work, and I'm not negating that aspect of beauty in saying this. I'm saying like that can actually be a feature of how we consume. And then sort of understand what we engage with, the artistic works that we engage with, as pieces of knowledge that can then be put on a shelf, and we have the sense that we know that. And so what are the ways in which we can become more aware of how we are listening in these works, through these works, to the land, to the life of land? And it's also it's a very tall ask for any artist to be so responsible to so many things at the same time. So one of the things I was going to talk about, I think in the last question that I didn't get to, was my own return to an artistic practice that I was primarily an artist in my graduate student days, and then shifted when I did my postdoctoral work into what eventually became Hungry Listening, the book. But I'm returning to that now and asking these very difficult questions of myself as an artist, which I think is really, really important. So, I don't just simply critique all the time and say, oh, these things are wrong, horribly wrong, and then don't sort of turn that toward myself. So I had the opportunity, very briefly, I'll just say I had the opportunity to create a work for listening. It was an audio work on Cortes Island as part of a symposium that was called Geopoetics. There's a couple people who were there. And it was a really interesting opportunity for me to reflect on my relationship, or my ancestors' relationship to this place, now called Cortes Island, Clahus land. But then also to ask myself, what do I provide not just for human listeners in a listening experience of a work, but what can I give to, what can I offer to the land as my relation? Can I actually offer something to the land without having a consistent, I have never been to Cortes Island actually before this point. So, but my ancestors are always in relationship with Clahus folks, and so Hwalmach have always been and have always arrived in Clahus lands and shared and traded and had good relationships with Clahus folks. So I made a choice at a certain point in this audio recording for human listeners to give up or to not listen anymore and place their headphones on the land where I would say something back that I won't share here, but that was my attempt to reckon with the question of what I might offer back through language and words, and in Halkomelem, which is a language that would always be heard there when Hwalmach visited Clahus lands. So it is, I thought I would add that into the mix.
Yeah, it strikes me that your positions are in some ways quite distinct, but the topic of climate and the environment sort of points out some places where they intersect. So I was thinking about what it is that you're both, what you are critical of in your work, and for you, Hildy, it's more kind of, it seems to me that it's been sort of maybe empty listening or listening that's just kind of going on unaware, without full awareness, whereas for Dylan, you talk about hungry listening, and I was going to ask if you could unpack that concept a little bit for us. But they seem to be kind of like opposite ends of the spectrum, where one is a kind of vapid, empty listening, and the other one is a kind of instrumentalized listening that's being too quickly used or put to work for a particular end. But then in relation to climate, you have a similar sort of focus in that you mentioned in your text in the book, Hildy, like your problem that you have with the kind of spectacularizing impulse of nature documentaries, and the way that sound is often occluded or overwritten in those documentaries by like narrative or by dramatic pieces of music and things like that, and what the alternative to just actually what it would be like to really just hear those environments. And this strikes me as somehow similar to the resistance against climate grief and centering one's own position. So I don't know if you could respond to that.
I mean, I think we might be talking about a slightly different focus rather than being at sort of opposite ends, is that given our cultural, social backgrounds, me as a German immigrant, you as indigenous, close inside indigenous culture, Canadian, settler indigenous. Is that how you put it? Yeah, my language is, yeah. So I think, you know, the focus in our lives was born in that context. And so I found it always very important to do awareness raising, to educate, to wake people's hearing up in a way of the way I had experienced it, is in a way of sharing, because I was so excited by the discoveries that happen when you start listening. And that excitement is mirrored every time we do a sound walk with a group of people. The inspiration of discovering your own listening is quite strong every time when you actually do it. And so that's where we are completely, I think, on the same level, understanding that listening is an ever-shifting perceptual entity that we have, a treasure, and there's a rediscovery all the time. And what I love about the fact that this book is coming out is that it takes a lot of that work that I've done over the years, grabs one idea from the Wilderness Radio, and makes something completely new of it. And the fact that you have done this 24-hour recording in the Saturna wetlands, and then the project grows from there into unexpected new levels, for you even unexpected, I think, right? It's alive. That's what's so important about it, that when you do the listening, these things stay alive, and they become new and renewed all the time. And so I think as I got older, the really exciting aspect I discovered is that if you really listen to your own listening, I used to call it, or notice how you listen, notice how your relationship changes to any situation through your own listening, there's always something to chew on, something to learn, something to be inspired by. And I feel that the hungry listening concept has made me viscerally aware of something that's been lingering in my mind all the time, is that when I go field recording, I get a product, I get an object, I get a file, an audio file. And then what do you do with that? Are you hungry to show off your work? Are you hungry to get other listeners to, what do you want to do with all that? And it's at that point that it's crucial to understand one's own context from which voice one speaks. Remember enthusiastically recording everything I could when I was in India. What an amazing culture, and there was all these beautiful sounds and everything coming at me, and I just recorded. And then the question became, okay, I have all these recordings now, what do I do? And the only way I could actually begin to act and do something to compose with these sounds was to understand that I was a complete outsider, a visitor. Yes, I had worked a bit in India, but I was the visitor, and that was the voice with which I could confidently speak about a relationship that was beginning to become a new relationship to a new culture that I had not known about. And so it became a conversation. And nowadays I like to say, I'm not just a composer, I'm not a composer here by myself. I'm actually in collaboration with the sounds of the environment. My compositional voice and the sounds of the environment are doing the speaking together. So it's a type of collaboration, and that's how I could kind of make sense out of the materiality of having a field recording, and not feel that I was dealing with an object that I bought and captured.
Just a pick up a bit on field recording there as well. We obviously, Indigenous folks have a long history of having our songs and words gathered by ethnographers and folks, recording, doing field work, who felt that our cultures were dying away as part of this thing that's called the salvage paradigm. Often they, were people like Marius Barbeau going into our communities to salvage our songs and then hold them at places like the Canadian Museum of Civilization or Canadian Museum of History, where they still exist separate from us. And a lot of there was that historical hunger for preservation that a lot of our leaders in our communities participated in sharing songs that would never be shared, with outsiders, and done so because of this time of great precarity. At the height of the residential schools, at the height of the Section 3 of the Indian Act banning potlatches and our cultural practices. So there were choices made, to say, but those choices were made actually with the understanding that these songs, these recordings would be there for our generation, my children's generation, future generations, when they needed to be. And so that's where we are right now. But I mean, that history of field recording was also a history where many folks felt that they were gathering treasures of cultural treasures. And we actually sometimes refer to our cultural practices as our cultural wealth, and so there's that aspect of it too. I just wanted to respond, to that aspect of field recording, but then also to say around listening and listening to one's listening. It's a practice that you can. If you are always listening to your own listening, you then run the risk of taking your listening away from your relation, the thing that you're listening to. It's this hyper-awareness of how am I listening now? How am I listening now? How am I listening now, right? This is sort of like the equivalent of the anxiety, I think, around a lot of changes that are happening, right? Right now, trying to be more aware of who we are and what our positionalities are. And so I really value, the work of the Wetland Project and these sort of different layers and iterations of that work as a sensitizing, right? Because I think about this work as iterative and gradual, the work of understanding our positionalities and how we listen as, doing that in one moment, in this moment now, and then coming back to that in a moment later. And that cumulative approach means that we are gradually shaping our relationship to how we listen and gradually reflecting more and in different ways, and maybe even in contrasting ways, so that what can then happen is that acts as itself as a sort of background hum that we don't even always need to be aware of or hyper-aware of, because if we become hyper-aware of how we're listening, to ourselves as we listen, it takes us out of listening, I think. So it's a bit of a strange, I don't know if it's exactly a paradox, but the sort of iterative sensitization to listening and listening positionality is absolutely key. And in a really specific way, I have access to this, right, to the recording and to the book, but I wish I was here for the music performance. What kind of sensitization would I have had if I was in relation with human singers, singing the work? How would that have become another level that could have sensitized me different to this place and the life that I'm hearing now? I think it would have been really interesting. Or when it happens in Paris, that's another. Maybe I'll just have to come to Paris.
Yes, one of the points that really kind of struck me from the piece in the book, Dylan, was kind of like acknowledging what listening can do and what it can be, but also being honest about what it is not and what it is not a substitute for. It's not a substitute for actual presence. It's not a substitute for visiting with having relationships. So it's kind of at a remove, but it still, despite that, or even because of that, has a new set of possibilities. And so I wanted to ask you about what you think the sort of alternatives to your objects of critique are. Like, how do you practice a deep listening, and what does it mean to kind of to listen deeply enough that you do become connected to something?
Yeah, just let me take a break.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so on the one hand, I understand this work as providing a productive remove, right? I don't have to physically be there on the site and trampling around and, maybe doing harm, maybe, if I'm a visitor that doesn't know anything coming into this place. And on the other hand, I feel like the work that we do together in sound walks or in various practices is essential in that face-to-face reckoning. I'm very, it's funny, even, so Levinas comes out of the blue. I was rereading, I was like, I bring Levinas up in this? And I just laugh because it's a very old kind of reading and work for me, but what I really value from Levinas is this idea of the face-to-face encounter, the irreducibility of that face-to-face encounter, where there's an ethics entailed by what he calls the face of the other, and he doesn't mean the literal face, he means sort of the presence of another human and their irreducible difference to yourself that cannot be consumed. And I think that's both. He thinks of this as something that is unique to humans. I don't understand it in that way. I also feel that place and the land and our non-human relations also have this level of irreducibility that we are confronted with when we are in these places. So I guess where that leaves me is how to find that balance, right, between being in place together and having those moments of reckoning or grappling with each other and our difference and our indifference to the life that we are also in relationship of the land. Yeah.
Yeah, there's sort of what I've always loved about sound walking is that you actually never forget the place where you've been when you've been on a sound walk. And at the same time, there's this sort of lovely concept that it's kind of useless, like the uselessness of listening, really. We're just there, we're just present, and we're letting the environment work on us in conversation with our own thinking that goes on at the same time. Inevitably, there will be an inner chat that may be going on, and so we're in conversation with the place and our existence inside that at the same time when we're on sound walks. And when it's in groups, we have a chance afterwards to discuss all that. I just wanted to bring up in this context, the sort of challenge when you take children on sound walks in schools. Schools are places where you're commanded to listen. You have to listen, otherwise you're not going to learn anything. It's an obeying kind of listening. That's the tradition in the educational system. And even though many schools really try to do it differently, when I worked with a music teacher at the SFU elementary school some years ago, I thought, how do you get children to listen on a sound walk in that sort of useless, open way without them thinking that they have to do something for school or to show something for it? How do you do that? How do you distinguish that? And I don't really have an answer for it. It's I think a part of having to change schools and creating a kind of a listening, soundwork listening in schools where learning is desired and is not an authority. And I found it remarkable to take children on sound walks because they are open to discovery all the time and are open to that kind of inspiration. So if you take them far away from, out of that format of a school, then there is that kind of listening that is really just about life, the way we exist in daily life. We can't really always control our listening, as you say. There's no way, and you can't always listen to your own listening. But you are, that background hum idea, I like that there is that sort of consciousness of coming closer and further away from your own awareness of where you are at any given moment. And of course, it doesn't just apply to listening, it applies to our perceptual body altogether, right? So I will stop rambling.
On that, because I think it's really important what you're, that sense of oscillation, right? Or I think of it as an oscillation, but being in relationship and moving back and forth, because those spaces of learning, what they often attempt to do, even sort of flexible teaching spaces, is cancel out relationships so that all you look at is the whiteboard or the projection or the chalkboard, whatever it is. Your focus has to become, what you're told is that in order to learn, your focus needs to become singular. And of course, with all the sort of inundation of social media and this kind of thing, I know I myself have a challenge with having focus, but I don't think that focus is different than oscillation. We can move our listening to a space and then into the classroom and then out to another space, and sort of this kind of movement between kinds of attention is something that I think many Indigenous folks have always had, that was understood as an inability to have focus. But really, we were exercising our value systems around relationship and relationality with land that was only understood as an inability to have a kind of civilized focus. And I think that this is what one of the challenges for education as well, how to work within, how to redesign a system infrastructurally as well, that allows us to listen and look and be in relationship more, and in particular ways, not just so that everything is available all at once, but to ask us to alternate and oscillate and have different kinds of movement between in our attention. That is really important.
So I'm going to open it up for questions in just a second, and maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I just wanted to reflect on the book itself in relation to the Wetland Project as a whole. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about how often when we're talking about listening, we're trying to work against the overly visual or the overly textual, but then we have this book that is a visual and textual object. And so just to think about how that supports what this object is doing and the way that it's supporting our listening, I was personally struck by the extremely beautiful photographs of the ground and the plants and the marsh that are included in it, but there are all kinds of different things in it. So I also just wanted to give you a chance to kind of reflect on this book itself and what that's been.
Yes, that's why we're here. I urge you to look at it and buy it, of course. I think it's a marvelous production that allows us to interact with it. It has, it has space in it. It allows for you to open it anywhere and perceive it. Touch it, see it. It has the ability that we can listen to things. But this QR code thing, which I'm not completely understanding yet, but I'll learn, where you can actually instantly listen to excerpts, I guess, from this beautiful recording. And so it's playful. It allows us to experience your discovery of the wetlands in all sorts of different ways. And I'm absolutely impressed of how you guys developed that. And of course, there's also the musical score in there, and there's incredible writing and quotes from other people who've experienced the incredible writing and others, and the quotes from people who've experienced the radio program over the years, and the way they related to it, and their relationship to Saturna Island, whether they lived there or whether they were in New York, what is their relationship to it. So I think the book has potential for ongoing living experiences.
I might just say very briefly that one of the striking qualities of the book is the color, and of the installation as well, the shifts in color. And at first when I saw this, I was just looking at the PDF copy, I was really confronted with like what I perceived as strong differences. It was sort of like, referring to a sound, a really discreet bird call or something, and then this bright red. I was just sort of taken aback and thought, like, I have to spend time with that. And eventually I started to think about that as a really important way to shift how the color acts as a kind of filter in itself for listening. We can think about the color as maybe even, or a timbre, that has potential to act as a question or to shift the way that we think we might know what we could hear. I mean, we're in the realm of audiation now, right? Imagining, because in the book you can with QR codes listen to things, but often the page is just the page. And so I really enjoyed that the more time I spent with it, thinking about the relationship between the ideas, the text, the color, the sound, and where that led my thinking, and I think probably also listening. Yeah.
Do you want to use a microphone for questions, or? I don't think we can, right? Okay. Or you can shout. Yes.
Oh, for sure. I think we do it. As a part of listening. I think reflection is part of listening. That something comes in and we are interpreting it. We are. We're shifting its understanding as it comes in. And sometimes we may consciously stop because we've heard something and we have to reflect on it. We have to sit back and listen to what our thoughts are. So I think there's different qualities of reflection that are implied in listening in that respect. I would not be able to explain this scientifically, but that's the way I experience it. That when I think of the discussions after a sound walk, you hear people reflecting on that experience, and which is different from while they were listening, right? So it becomes a reflection on a reflection. I mean, I don't want to overtalk this, but I think we all sort of know that we are doing something as we're listening. And that's to me also always the sort of grounding aspect of it, that it implies reflection, it implies getting in touch with something that we're experiencing. Yeah, yeah. There's also exactly. There's often the feedback that I get from some of my compositions is that people see it, and I think our visual senses, our oral sense is very much connected with the visual sense. There's a synesthesia that happens at that point, and so we see. The object of what we're listening to, but we may be seeing colors, we may be seeing all sorts of other things. Yeah. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, I think about the educational context again and the way in which often teaching is related to sort of knowing a thing. And that when the thing is presented through a lecture, through a reading, or through a listening, then you know, you can identify a thing. And I think what I'm moving toward more now is thinking about the repetition and return to listening, to stay with the thing over a whole class, to reflect after one listening what the thing is, what we know of the thing, what we don't, what we're confused by. Then the second time, or focusing in even more on a very small part of the thing, and the third thing, that return, I think, to reflect and to think about how our relationship to knowledge changes is really important and overlooked in a lot of the teaching that I had when I was taking courses more frequently. And I think in terms of sound walks as well, I've been on some sound walks where that return actually happens. You move through. I went on a wonderful sound walk with my dear friend Audra McCartney, who is now passed on, and we looped. We went back through the place several times, and it was really an important teaching for me to have that sort of, rather than, I think maybe the first time I was thinking, wait, we've been here, and then I was like, wait a minute, that's fine that we've been here. There's something different now in this moment, and then the next, and then the next. So yeah, reflection, ongoing reflection with the same, I think is also really important.
Over here and then over there? Or
I guess to expand on that idea, what's your relation to the temporary nature of sound in nature compared to how technology can capture and then infinitely reproduce those sounds? How does that make you feel about the value of the sound that's recorded compared to hearing it in the moment and not again?
Well, that's of course what technology has done to us, is that we've gotten used to the fact that we can always listen back, and beforehand a sound was lost. You would hear it and it would be gone. And I think that has created a huge difference in attention, in that when you have in the back of your mind that you are making a recording, you can always listen back to it, it may lose some of its preciousness, really, or its specialness. Also its dependence on time and season and place. You take it away from all that, and then you're listening to it as a removed object. And in terms of perception, it wakes you up to the sound in a way that you may not have had the chance to listen with such intensity and re-listen and re-listen and really understand the sound in more depth. That has its own value, that we can get to know. What I find amazing when I record a sound and then on top of it as a composer I process it, like let's say a raven sound, and in slowing down a raven sound at one point, it it showed, the slowed down version showed me the beauty and intensity of the actual sound. And when you then listen back to the original on tape, you change your relationship to that sound. But it doesn't necessarily, then of course you're away from the place, you're away from that whole experience. And to me it's always been very important to bring my own recordings into the studio, because the experience of recording and being in the place and smelling and feeling and tasting it enters your compositional process at the same time. And then you can maybe harken back to that relationship that you've had when you heard the sound unrecorded. But you know, over 100 years ago, none of that was possible. Every sound was lost to us as soon as it had happened.
So I've been really challenged lately by thinking about how recordings of our ancestors continue to live, continue to have life through the technological form that they are mediated in. Challenged because there's such strength and vitality and beauty in the life that it continues to live in the audio recording, and then challenged because that life is constricted by recording as well. And you know, museums do things to the life of our ancestors that are particular and not good, and the life is impacted in many ways. So, and technology, those recordings don't, do not. How should I put this? They do not dampen that life a lot of the time either, right? It's not just as a way of saying, it continues to live. And I've really been taught a lot by friends of mine who are Niska, who really understand the persistence of that life through the mediated forms. So yeah, this is sort of a rambling answer, but I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, and I would say no. In the sense that when I hear, I don't know, love, yeah, a kind of love, yeah. Closeness, intimacy, proximity. Maybe just the word love is sitting with me a bit strangely right now. But I appreciate your question as a moment to think about what is that connection that I feel, which is also an ambiguous or ambivalent connection, I would say, sometimes. That has intimacy and happiness sometimes embedded within it, but it's complicated.
My question is, the conversation has been really interesting in talking about listening in terms of maybe awareness and response, even like a sense of responsibility for how you listen or how you represent or how you understand. But this project also went out on talk radio for many years as a 24-hour broadcast. And so for me listening to it in that context, I also listen
Maybe I could answer that one. I was thinking a lot about how I first kind of encountered the Wetland Project and the first piece of writing that I did that was about this piece. And it was kind of my response to listening to the Earth Day broadcast during lockdown. And I think it kind of like raised a lot of the points, or this experience of hearing this wetland at home, but also being kind of like forced to be at home, and then being able to read the responses from people on Twitter as well who were having a similar experience. This experience of having kind of like a distributed or like post-geographical community, that we were listening to this. We were in relation to a place that none of us were in. That was weird. And just so, and thinking about like the way that listening became important during the pandemic, like my mum back in England was getting up really early that spring to listen to the dawn chorus because there was no road traffic. So it was like a particularly good time to listen to these natural sounds. And I felt like the Wetland Project broadcast, it had been doing this for several years already, but in this particular moment, it really crystallized a lot of these, the potentials of listening to kind of wilderness environments or natural environments, but also this disjuncture of being like locked at home, the realities of why we were locked at home, like that was a weirdness as well. So I think it is a weird project, and that's why it kind of is perennially interesting. Did you want to add to that?
Just very short, when the broadcast was happening the first time, I just put on the radio in the house and went about my business. And then I would be away from it, and I'd come in and I thought, oh, I've never heard of, what was it? One of the birds here in my garden. And then, oh, okay, it's the broadcast. And that was really weird when that happened, but I also loved it. I just thought it was wonderful, bringing in this environment and bringing in that space into my own home soundscape.
I haven't listened to the work in the durational way that you're describing, but I think it would be really, I love durational work. I think the imposition, and it is a different kind of thing as well when you turn it on and it's sort of present in your home as you're doing other things than it would be if you were in a gallery space listening where you weren't necessarily doing other things, or a concert hall or whatever it might be, right? And so I'm interested in what that kind of durational experience, what kind of experience that would be to treat it as a both as a everyday listening experience on the drive, durationally, if you have a long trip wherever, or if you're in your house and having it there and present, versus if it's durational in a space that's for aesthetic consideration first. And I haven't had any of those experiences really, but I'm interested to hear about yours.
Well, apparently the work is going to be shown again in Paris soon, so maybe let's go to Paris and we can watch it and have a durational experience. I'm going to leave it there since we've been talking for a while, but if you do have more questions, you can come and find us perhaps. But just thank you very much for all coming out for this project, and congratulations, Mark and Brady, on this amazing book and project.